Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to have to apologize. I didn't make enough handouts this week because I was going by last week's attendance. I made too many last week, so I didn't make enough this week. But, so if there are couples here who can share, that might be good. So this week is Cleopatra, but as always, I have to make up for what I missed last week in Hatshepsut, both in omissions and I have to make some corrections. Last week was kind of difficult for me, as you know, because it was Egyptian ancient history, which can be fairly difficult because so much of it is contested. And anyway, so there are a few things I wanted to clear up or correct. I didn't make clear who the parents of Thutmose III was. So if I didn't make that clear, it was Thutmose II, the one who died fairly early, Hatshepsut's husband. He was the father, and one of his other wives, named Isis, was the mother. Also, I didn't clear up whatever happened to Hatshepsut's daughter, Nefertari, if I'm pronouncing that right. And I even told you I was going to clear that up. At the beginning of the lecture, somebody asked me, and I said, oh, I'll talk about that later, and I didn't. So, so to clear that up, we don't know what happened to her. So I'm hoping that clarifies it for you. But, so there are hints that she grew up and that she could have married Thutmose III. Some people believe that's possible and that she bore him a son, but we don't know. We know that she grew up at least into her late teens and that she died either somewhat just before or somewhat just after Hatshepsut died. And that's the extent, and even that's, it's all very sketchy. So there was also a question as to why men are depicted as black and women are depicted as tan in the ancient Egyptian pictures. And so I was looking into that, and someone had said that it was because they believed men were out in the sun more and should be darker and women were not. And some Egyptologists believe that. Others will say that it's more a spiritual or symbolic darkening rather than an actual darkening of the skin. So that clears that up too. I also have to make a correction because I was calling all of the gods just gods and not gods and goddesses. And somebody afterwards corrected me on that, and I thought you're absolutely right. I was calling them all gods, and I shouldn't have. There were gods, and there are goddesses. So I apologize for that one. Also, I wanted to, what I left out, I wanted to say last week on Thutmose III, when he grew up, after Hatshepsut died, he was a great military leader. For Egyptologists today, they consider him the Napoleon of Egypt because of his campaigns in conquering that he did of the nations around him. And finally, it was also pointed out, and by the way, I really do appreciate those of you who make comments and point out things that I've either left out or have been mistaken on. And I take that to heart, and I try to make corrections as necessary. So it was pointed out to me that Hatshepsut was only one among many pharaohs whose descendants or the pharaohs after her erased her name from the written records. She's not the only pharaoh who they tried to erase. Most famously, there was Akhenaten, some generations down, who tried to change the entire religion of Egypt into a monotheistic religion. And after he died, they tried to erase him as well. So she was not the only one, although she probably was the one that they erased because she was a woman. So, okay, enough of Hatshepsut. Now on to Cleopatra. You will notice on your handout, and again, I apologize, I'll try to get the right number next week. You know, you guys show up in numbers that change from week to week. So I should have known Cleopatra was going to be more popular than Hatshepsut. So anyway, on your handout, you have a picture of, this is a recreation, a computer-generated recreation of what they believe Hatshepsut would look like. Thank you. Okay, I got to get this straight. So Cleopatra. So this is a recreation of what they believe Cleopatra would look like from the coins that were left from her day. These three coins that you see are the depictions of Cleopatra. They are the only depictions that were made during her lifetime that still survive today. There were many statues and busts of her. None of them survive, but the coins do. Now, these are not the only coins that we still have. They're just the ones that I have printed out here for you. So anyway, if you look at the picture, it looks like it could be a realistic depiction. Although one picture that I saw, someone thought that she would look more like Britney Spears, although I don't think so. There are other coins that show her later in life where her face is a lot fuller, she's gained a lot more weight, and so some will say that her face is a lot not so thin as it is in this depiction. So anyway, going on to the bibliography. A lot of very good books on Cleopatra. This first one, Don Nardo, is an editor of a short book that it compiles several different historians that depict different episodes of her life and put together in this one book. So it's her complete life from different historians portraying different parts of her life. And so it's a nice short read, and if you want something really quick, this is a pretty good one. This next one, Diana Preston, Cleopatra and Antony. You notice she switched the names around to give Cleopatra precedence. And, you know, with good reason. She was an amazing person, amazing leader. A very good read. This is one that I'd probably recommend best as a nice summer read because it's a quick, very entertaining book. The next one, Lucy Hughes Hallett, Cleopatra: Histories, Dreams, and Distortions. As the title suggests, it's not just about her life, but about all the different lives that other people have depicted her living. Cleopatra is in many, many stories throughout the ages, the past 2,000 years. She's a very prominent name that lots of people wanted to give their input and create myths and legends about her. And so this is not just her life, but what others have thought of her down through the ages. Stacy Schiff, Cleopatra. This one is an excellent book as well. Stacy Schiff has won the Pulitzer Prize several years ago for a biography that she had written about someone else. but she's a very good author. She expands on a lot of things that help you understand the times in which Cleopatra lived. And she's very good at that. She has a long description of the city of Alexandria and what that was like in Cleopatra's day, among other things. So I would highly recommend that as well. This last one, Michael Grant, if you are at all into ancient history, you have seen or have a book by Michael Grant. Anytime you go into a used bookstore and you go into the section of ancient Greece and Rome, you will see Michael Grant's works. He's the most prolific of the popular writers of ancient Greece and Rome. You will see his books all the time. And he's, of the books that I have here, he's the most academic, probably the most scholarly, and the one that these other authors derive a lot of information from. He's one of the standards of ancient Greece and Rome. And now I'm going to put in a couple of fiction works here. I've talked about Colleen McCullough before, and you know her from the Thornbirds, right? A great author. This is the last volume of the 7-volume series, The Masters of Rome. And very good. She's just a very entertaining author and very scholarly as well. This last one, I haven't read the whole book. I've read parts of it. Kind of long, 964 pages. How many of you are familiar with this at all? They made a TV series, I think, out of this as well. The Memoirs of Cleopatra, as if Cleopatra had written her memoirs of her life. And it's a good, entertaining read if you like historical fiction. I would, for me, I disagree on a number of things that she portrays Cleopatra as being a much more compassionate person than I think she actually was. But other than that, it's not a bad read. I'm going to start doing something new with these lectures, and I'm going to add in movies that I'm familiar with. And for those of you who have been to my other lectures, you'll know that this is one of my favorite all-time movies with Elizabeth Taylor, Rex Harrison, Richard Burton, and Roddy McDowall, who also I really appreciate as an actor. 1963. If you haven't seen this one, it's a good long movie, and it is one of the most lavish productions. It lost a lot of money, I understand, because it was very, very expensive. But wow, what a movie. There's so much to this. Next one, this was a play that was written by George Bernard Shaw, Caesar and Cleopatra, that was made into a movie back in 1945. I happened to catch this. I had no idea this was even a movie. I caught it on Turner Classic Movies. And it's a very entertaining movie. I really liked it. It has very little historical value, though. So you watch this only for entertainment purposes. But it has, again, two of my favorite actors, Claude Rains, who was in Casablanca as the police captain, the French police captain. And also Vivian Leigh, who we know from Gone with the Wind. Very good, very good. Oh, but I wanted to say also, one of the things about this that makes it so historically off base is Vivian Leigh portrays a very meek, weak, shy character that Caesar helps develop into a strong person. But that was just not even clear, not even nearly close enough to the real thing. And of course we have Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. I happen to have this version of it with Richard Johnson and Janet Sussman. She portrays Cleopatra, I think, very well. She has a very powerful voice to her. How many of you have seen this one? Anybody? This was on television back in 1974. Again, historically, it's not the best. It's very typical that the story of Antony and Cleopatra, for romance purposes, is portrayed in a way that just is not really, not the way it really happened. And we'll get to that. But of course, you don't read Shakespeare because of its historical accuracy. It's the literature that's so great about Shakespeare. Okay. So, going back to the ancient Roman Empire, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans. Egypt at this time had been run by Greeks for hundreds of years. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt back in 332 BC. He took it from the Persians, who had been running it. It was a very quick and easy campaign at the time. And he created Greek cities. Naucratis, Ptolemaeus, Praetorianum, if I can get that right. And of course Alexandria, the greatest of them all. Each of these four cities was primarily Greek. The Greeks came over and populated these cities and pretty much took control. And so the first of the Ptolemies became king in 304 BC, and then we have all the way down to Ptolemy the 12th, who was Cleopatra's father, who ruled from 80 to 51. At that time, Rome, during this time, became the power in the ancient Mediterranean. And if you were another power in the Mediterranean, you either were destroyed, like Carthage, or you took protection from Rome. Those were your choices. At the time, the Ptolemies could see the direction the winds were blowing. And Ptolemy the 12th, having difficulty at home, decided that he needed Rome's protection from his own people. And so he went to Rome and pleaded with them to be a client state. He actually paid them to come and protect him and on his throne so that he could rule Egypt under the protection of the Roman Empire. So he kept his throne. He was still in power. He was still the king. And Egypt was somewhat independent, but it was under the protection of Rome. And the amount of money that he paid, it was 6,000 talents, which was more than the annual income of the entire Egyptian nation. And it wasn't something that he could just give right away. It was something that he had to make payments over several years. And he did not finish by the time he was dead. So, the Roman perceptions of Egypt, Egypt being in the east, was considered very exotic. It was a foreign, strange. It was both attractive and repulsive in many ways. It was rich, and it was richer than Rome because of the Nile Valley and the trade from Egypt. Egypt was a more wealthy nation than Rome itself. And one of the sayings that I really like, it's a shame to lose, a risk to conquer, and a headache to govern. That's how the Roman leaders thought of that. And because, again, of the Nile Valley, they provided 1/3 of the grain to Rome that Rome desperately needed as Rome grew and grew. The most prominent city in Egypt was the Greek city of Alexandria. It was the greatest city in the Mediterranean in more ways than one. The population, depending on who you're reading, it varied anywhere from 300,000 up to 1 million. I think most historians will guesstimate around 500,000. They were known as very industrious people and very contentious as well. And we're talking about the Greeks, ethnic Greeks, not the Egyptians themselves. So some of the products that they made, papyrus was one of the biggest. Paper being a very expensive commodity, they produced it and made quite a fortune in Egypt for that. Linen, incense, and glass. Glass blowing, by the way, is something that was developed by the Greeks round about this time. So the city of Alexandria could be a very luxurious city. There are many baths, literally hundreds of theaters, gymnasiums, temples, shrines, and synagogues. There was a very significant population of Jews in Alexandria at this time. And they had automatic doors, hydraulic lifts, treadmills, and coin-operated machines. The most advanced city possibly in the world. Not comparing the Chinese at this time, which may have been more advanced, but certainly in the Mediterranean world, Alexandria was the most advanced. And as I say, glass blowing was developed at this time to a great art form where they could weave into it gold and silver and other pictures that they could make. And of course, Alexandria was known for the great library with possibly upwards of 100,000 scrolls there. And then the great lighthouse, which was built a couple hundred years previous to our time, one of the great wonders of the world. So here is, I wanted to get you a good picture of Alexandria and where it sits in Egypt. So here's Egypt. Here is Alexandria. You'll notice it's on a kind of a peninsula, a spit of land in the delta. And then closer up, this is what Alexandria would look like. It's about 4 miles long. And you have, it shows you where the library is, the great harbor, the lighthouse up here. And I have that on your handout as well. And finally, we have the Roman Empire. Something we should all be familiar with, the Mediterranean area. And here's Egypt and Alexandria right on the coast there. Now I'm going to give kind of a brief overview of what we believe Cleopatra was like as a person. She was not known ever in her day as being exceptionally beautiful. That was not her allure at all. It was the charm of her presence. It was her speaking voice. It was the force of her personality that enchanted so many people at the time. So these are some of the quotes that Plutarch had made of her that he had read about. A peculiar force of character which pervaded her every word and action. It was a delight to hear her speak. The charm of her presence was irresistible. And that's something that it would be really nice if Hollywood could pick up on that. Not an easy thing to do for any writer or actor to portray a character with a force of personality and a charm like that. Elizabeth Taylor notwithstanding. And again, here's some images of Cleopatra. There were other coins as well that depicted her, but these some of the most popular. And again, the coins are our only indication of what she looked like. Nothing else remains. One of the things I wanted to point out, in this one, she's wearing pearls. Pearls were the great extravagance of the day. They were the diamonds or the rubies of their day. And if you had pearls, you were a rich person because they were very, very expensive. And she loved them. There is a story that's apocryphal. It couldn't have happened, but she was known for being a very extravagant person, giving out very lavish gifts and wasting money on a grand scale just because she could. And one of these stories was that she was with Mark Antony, and he would comment about what beautiful pearls she had. And she said, "Oh, that's nothing, watch this." And she had a glass of vinegar, put a pearl in it, a very expensive pearl. The pearl dissolves, and then she drinks it down. That could not have happened. First of all, drinking vinegar is a pretty awful thing to do. Secondly, pearls don't dissolve like that in vinegar. We know because people have tried. But anyway, she was known for her extravagance, the lavish parties that she would give as a sign of how powerful she was. And that's not, that was a very common thing for a leader of a country, a king or a queen, a pharaoh, to do, to demonstrate to the world how powerful and rich they are. So, going back to our time, there was a civil war in Egypt because after Ptolemy the 12th died in 51 BC, he left Cleopatra. And by the way, someone else pointed out to me that this is Cleopatra the 7th. I was not going to put Cleopatra the 7th as a title because that would just confuse everybody, or many people, because in our minds, how many Cleopatras are there? There's only one Cleopatra, right? Well, she was Cleopatra the 7th officially, but in our hearts, she's the only one. So, once Ptolemy the 12th died, he has Cleopatra, who's 18 years old, and her half-brother, Ptolemy the 13th, who's 10 years old, to rule as co-rulers. Now, she was 18 and the eldest, and she was expected to be a ruler, but according to the traditions of Egypt, she could not rule alone as a woman. And so she had to have a husband, and of course, as we know, even the Greeks took on many customs of the Egyptians over time, because the Egyptian way was for brothers and sisters to marry to keep all the royal bloodline pure. And so she was to marry her 10-year-old brother, and they were to rule together as co-rulers. Well, since both of them were fairly young, and Cleopatra, after all, she was a woman, could not rule, there was a regency council to take charge. And Cleopatra, being a very intelligent and very forceful person, even at 18, was not going to stand for it. And so there was a split in the council, and Cleopatra was wanting to be the ruler. And she wasn't going to let her 10-year-old son or the... thank you.
Fiance.
Yeah, fiance. Her 10-year-old half-brother fiance have any say, along with Pothinus, who was the leader of the regency. So there was a big split. She knew that her life was in danger. She fled Egypt. At the time, there's also a civil war in Rome. Julius Caesar had marched on Rome and was going after Pompey to be the dictator of Rome. Caesar defeated Pompey at Parnassus. Pompey flees to Egypt, since Egypt is a friendly nation, expecting asylum there, and he was promptly killed. Caesar arrived a few days after, not very happy that they had killed Pompey. They thought they were doing Caesar a favor, but he was not happy. Anyway, so Caesar now arrives. He's defeated his major rival, and now he's planning on settling things in Egypt. He has, on the one hand, you have Pothinus, who is the regency council leader, and Ptolemy. At this time now he's 13. This is a couple years later. And you have Cleopatra. Once he arrived, he wanted to get everybody together to settle this. He had no particular interest in who was going to be the leader, but he wanted it settled. So he sent a message to Cleopatra for her to come back. Cleopatra wanted to come back, but knew that the armies were against her, so she snuck in. The legend was that she had wrapped herself in a carpet and had one of the servants, a friend, bring her in and unraveled her in front of Caesar. It was probably more like some sort of burlap sack rather than a carpet, but carpet's close enough for Hollywood. And so, in any case, she's 21 now. She did sneak in past the guards and past the armies, and she presented herself to Caesar, and Caesar was immediately smitten with the charm of her presence. They say Caesar is not an easy man to surprise. He's usually the one who does the surprising of others, especially out on the battlefield. He's the type of guy you just could not predict what he was going to do next. And when a woman comes and surprises him, it was a big deal for him, and he took to her almost immediately. Historians will tell you that once she presented herself to him, they probably slept together that night. And another thing, Cleopatra, one of the myths about her was that she was very sexually active, very lascivious sort of woman, and slept with lots of different men. No historian will tell you that that's true. She probably slept with a grand total of 2 men in her life, and we know who those are. So anyway, she most likely, if it wasn't that night, it was very soon. They slept together, and she lost her virginity to Caesar shortly after meeting him. Now, one of the big questions that historians ask, did she love Caesar or Antony, or was she just playing the survival game? Was she just trying to get close to the greatest power in order to save her own skin? Of course, we don't know. By all appearances, both Caesar and Antony were both very struck with her. So it's not, I don't think it's a far stretch to think that she loved them as well. So in any case, Caesar comes back, and when Ptolemy, who's 13 years old, sees that Cleopatra has snuck in and gotten to Caesar first, he threw a grand temper tantrum and stomped out into the streets, screaming that it's not fair that Cleopatra's usurping him, and the people who, generally speaking, sided with Ptolemy, rose up and came close to a riot until Caesar sent the legions out and settled it down a bit. But in Anyway, so Caesar got them together and said, look, this is the way Ptolemy the 12th set it up. You are to be co-rulers. You are to be married, and you are to rule together. And that's the way we're going to do it. And so it's interesting that Caesar generally took Cleopatra's side from the beginning. Even though he was putting them together as co-rulers, he was really siding with Cleopatra. And some historians will take this as another sign that he really favored her. He loved her. At least he cared more about her than Ptolemy, because both the military and the bureaucracy, and generally the people, favored Ptolemy over Cleopatra. And Caesar was going against the grain in that way. But that's what he was going to stick with. And so Pothinus, not liking this situation, he calls for the Egyptian army to come and attack. Caesar has about 4,000 troops. There's about 20,000 troops there in Alexandria, or on the outskirts, ready to attack. And so Caesar was in a bind. He was in a sense trapped in Alexandria. He had the palace to hold up in and to fight until reinforcements came. But it was a very touch-and-go situation for some time. One of the first things he did, since he was bottled up in the harbor with many Egyptian ships, he went out and he had them burned. And as we know, that caught many other things on fire in the harbor. Historians will tell you now that we do not believe that the great library was burned to the ground at that time. There was a warehouse that probably was attached to the library or close to it that burned, but not the library itself. The library itself was destroyed a few hundred years later. So how that came about, I'm not really sure, but in any case, the library most likely did not burn at that time. So here's Caesar, sent for reinforcements, but he's trapped, and he needs to kind of play a delaying game. One of the other things that Achilles, who was the general fighting against him, did that was fairly clever was to dump salt water in the water system so that they had nothing to drink. And Caesar's men panicked, thinking, this is the end. We've got nothing. We need water. Caesar said, dig a hole. We will get water. So they dug a hole, and sure enough, they had fresh water. So eventually the reinforcements arrive under Mithridates, and these were reinforcements that were not Roman soldiers. They were a collection of soldiers that were allied to Rome from various countries, one of which was Judea. Judea at the time wanted to make good with Caesar. Judea had been conquered by Pompey, who was Caesar's, who was in power before Caesar, and Caesar conquered Pompey, and so the Jews were appreciative of that, and so they wanted to be on Caesar's good side, and they helped out in this instance. So this the depiction of the Library of Alexandria, which probably did not burn at this time. So when the reinforcements arrived, Caesar sneaks out of and joins the troops. He defeats the Egyptians in a great pincer movement, and Ptolemy drowned in the Nile. Now for Caesar, when he found out that Ptolemy, who was trying to escape, drowned in the Nile, he immediately said, go get his body now. Dredge him up, find him. I want his body. there are basically two reasons for that. One, to prove that he was actually dead, so nobody could pretend, as often happened, somebody else could come along and said, I am Ptolemy, who you thought was dead. I am here to raise another army. The other reason was that there was a belief amongst the Egyptians that if you drowned in the Nile, you become a god. He did not want that to happen. He did not want any rallying point for the Egyptians. Yes?
Was this drowning an accident or an assassination?
As far as we know, it was an accident. It could have been assassination, but it's most likely in the panic of him trying to escape, it was an accident. Yes?
And he's just 13 years old?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Did they get him? Did they get him up?
Yes, they did find him and displayed him to the multitude, saying, here he is dead. I want you all to know that. So, Cleopatra became pregnant at this time with Caesar's child. There are some who have speculated that Cleopatra was pregnant with some other man's child. The reason for that is that Caesar, we know, had only 2 children. One was his daughter that was born something like 36 years before, and then his son with Cleopatra. So, for a man who was well known to be a womanizer, who is married 3 times, people question, well, why is it that we don't have any other children of Julius Caesar? And so it's a fair question. The main argument against that is that if Cleopatra slept with another man at this same time, it would have been well known. It's not something that would have been easily concealed by anybody. So since we have no record or no evidence of any other man close to Cleopatra, we're pretty sure that it was Caesar's child. So anyway, there's still the issue of Cleopatra ruling Egypt. She needed to be married to a royal personage and then be co-ruler. Fortunately, she had another younger brother, now half-brother, now Ptolemy the 14th, who's 12 years old, and she marries him. And now she could be the ruler of Egypt, and Caesar saw to it that she was in charge at that point.
Excuse me, I
Yes?
don't understand who are the parents of Ptolemy the...
So Ptolemy the 12th
Yes.
was Cleopatra's father. He also had other children from other women, and so that's the 13th and the 14th. Yes.
They named all the boys the same thing?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, kind of like George Foreman. Didn't he have like 8 kids all named George?
Do they know where Cleopatra went to when she left?
When she fled.
When she fled.
Yeah, she fled somewhere on the outskirts of Egypt, probably around Syria or Judea, or just on the outskirts in the Sinai somewhere. Yeah. So then there's this famous pleasure cruise that Caesar took with Cleopatra up the Nile in one of the very famous, the Egyptians were well known for their luxurious pleasure boats or pleasure barges that could be fairly large for the time. And so they took this trip, probably took a couple of weeks, up the Nile, and the Hollywood version is that it was just a luxury cruise. It was not. If you are the ruler of a country, it was very important that the people see you and are impressed by your grandeur. And this is what Cleopatra would have to do every so often. The kings of of Europe would call it a progress. And we'll talk about that in the weeks to come, that if you are a king or a queen, periodically, usually once a year, you take a progress through your lands so that the people can see you. This is the same thing here. Both Caesar and Cleopatra, along with the Roman legions, took a trip up the Nile to impress the population of their power and grandeur so that people are duly impressed and follow the rules.
Was the little boy with them?
Probably kept off to the side and just displayed for a moment. Here he is, your guy. And, yeah.
Well, excuse me.
Yes?
How did they have 400 ships left when they had already burned all of them?
So, yeah, very good question. The 400 ships were probably both Roman and some Egyptian. Egyptians at this time were well known to be great shipbuilders. And as we'll see later on, they built them at a prodigious rate. They had a great industry of shipbuilding at the time. But in any case, that's what I'm going by is what I read. So that's a good question, though. If so many of them were burned, I imagine that the 400 has come down to us by some report. It may be exaggerated. It may include smaller type vessels as well. But in any case, that's the number that had been reported. And here's an example of one of the pleasure barges that might have looked like. So, Caesar, after another campaign in North Africa, he goes back to Rome. He sends for Cleopatra. Cleopatra joins him in Rome, and she stays with him until he's assassinated a year and a half later. So she spent quite some time. And it was very important for her, in order for her to keep her power. She knows, and a lot of people in Rome knew, that Egypt was always kind of an iffy proposition. We love them and we hate them. We need them and we don't like needing them. And so anybody who was in power had to play up to Rome. And so her being attached to Caesar was very important, and her going to Rome to impress the Senate was also very important. She stayed at one of Caesar's many estates on the other side of the Tiber, and many senators came to visit and get to know her. During this time, Caesar celebrates his great triumphs over various other territories. Cleopatra's sister, I have not mentioned, who had joined the rebellion against her, was brought in chains as well, and she was marched in one of the triumphs. She was not killed, however. She was allowed to live and sent to a kingdom in Asia Minor for the time being. And the Senate, duly impressed with Cleopatra, reaffirmed the treaty of alliance between Egypt and Rome. At this time, Julius Caesar wants to add on to the Forum Romanum, famous in Roman history. It was approximately 130 feet by 50 or so. It was very crowded, and Julius Caesar thought, we need to expand this, largely for his own benefit, but it was in need of expansion, and so he expanded it, and now he has the Forum Julium, and in that forum, there's always temples and shrines. He built a temple of Venus and had a statue of Venus, and next to it he put a statue of Cleopatra, which to the Romans was a very remarkable thing to do. That is not something a Roman generally would do, to have a human being statue up there in the same temple as the god. This was something that was common with Egyptians, however. And so he was following in the tradition of Egypt, where a pharaoh would put a statue of himself with the gods of the Egyptians. And here's a picture of the Forum. And then, sadly, Caesar was assassinated. In his will, he left nothing to Cleopatra. He could not leave anything to Cleopatra for the same reason he could not have married her. He was a Roman. You cannot marry an Egyptian if you are a Roman, nor can you leave anything in your will to an Egyptian if you are Roman. So Cleopatra was left with nothing from Caesar, and now, yes?
General question. Was Cleopatra actually an Egyptian or a Greek family, a member of a Greek family?
Greek, yeah. Descended from the Ptolemies, who had conquered Egypt. Yes, she is Greek, ethnically speaking. So, yes.
So what happened to her son with Caesar?
You gotta wait for me to get there.
Oh. His sister.
So if she's Greek, could a Roman marry a Greek? If she's Greek, could a Roman marry a Greek?
No. Romans could only marry Romans. Now, that's not to say that it didn't happen. It did, but it wasn't supposed to happen. Just like in Egypt, if you were ethnically Greek, you were not supposed to marry ethnically Egyptian. Okay?
Another question.
Yes.
When you see Ptolemy's name, Ptolemy all down the line, if she had a sister who's not named Cleopatra, she was named Arsinoe or whatever it was.
Arsinoe, yes.
What?
They always had the choice. They didn't have to name everybody Ptolemy, but they liked the name, and so they wanted to continue the tradition. It wasn't like it was necessary. So Cleopatra, for many people, Cleopatra was not a very popular person, even when she was obviously with Caesar. Caesar was adored mostly. Cleopatra was not. She was seen as the seductress, the temptress, who had seduced the great leader, Julius Caesar, by many people. And so she was safe as long as Caesar was alive. Caesar now is dead, and she's no longer safe, and she knew it. So she leaves Rome, goes back to Egypt, and somewhat conveniently, Ptolemy the 14th died. And I say that for her it was convenient because, like her other siblings, all of whom eventually either died one way or another or she had assassinated, she didn't trust him. She believed that he would grow up like the others and there would be difficulties raising him, her husband, and there would be a split and she would no longer be in charge. This is, of course, speculation because we don't know that she killed Ptolemy, but historians generally believe that it's way too convenient that at this time he died. So most likely she had him poisoned. So he died, and now she can marry her son. And so she would now still be the ruler. She is the one in charge, and she was married to someone of the royal line, her son. So her son, called Caesarion, becomes the co-ruler. And not just for her convenience, but for his protection as well. Because as ruler, he's a lot less likely to be assassinated by others in the Egyptian hierarchy, in the Egyptian government, because he would have a certain amount of sacred identity to him.
How old was he?
He was about 3 years old, 2 or 3 years old at this time. So, now that Caesar has died, we have another Roman civil war. And by the way, the century before Christ in Rome was an awful time for civil wars. There were something like 6 of them in that 100-year period. And here's another one, and not the last. There was a triumvirate of Antony, Octavius, and Lepidus, who now assumed command, and now we're going to go after the conspirators who killed Caesar, led by Brutus and Cassius. So Cleopatra wanted to side with the triumvirs. She tried to send ships. There was some difficulty, there were some storms, and she couldn't quite do it. But we know that she did want to help them. And of course, the triumvirs defeat the assassins ultimately at Philippi in 42 BC. And so Rome has to be divided up again amongst the triumvirs. Mark Antony, who gets the east, we know as a character, he comes from an impoverished family, but it was distinguished. He was a large man, someone you'd probably think of as maybe a linebacker on a football team today. Big, husky man. He was tall, he was imposing, voracious appetite for both food and women, much like Caesar. Unlike many Romans, though, he absolutely loved Greek culture. Romans loved Greek culture, sometimes holding their noses, because it was a little too luxurious for them, unmanly, they might say. And yet, they knew that it was a culture that in many ways was greater than their own in things like literature and the arts. But Antony loved Greek culture, he loved Greek people, he loved to have a good time. He could laugh at himself, which was sometimes considered a very un-Roman thing. Yeah, he enjoyed having a good time. He could be at times very lazy, easygoing, overly trusting of people who shouldn't be trusted. But in any case, he was also a great tactical commander on the battlefield. He was not a good strategic commander on the battlefield. In other words, he was great when he was under Julius Caesar fighting against the Gauls or any other campaign that Caesar was on. He was one of the best. He was not so great when he is in command himself. And he had a very strong-minded wife named Fulvia. Plutarch says that in his mind, he believes that Cleopatra owed a debt to Fulvia because she taught Antony how to obey women. Because she was the strong-minded one in the relationship. Very imposing woman. And so here's some images of Mark Antony. He's on several coins too. Some of the coins depict his nose as being very flat, even more so than this one, as if it was broken at some time. I better hurry up, I'm way behind. So, of course, now that Antony is in charge of the East, he falls for Cleopatra as well. Her charms worked on him at least as well as they did on Julius Caesar. But the first thing, though, he needed money. he needed supplies because he was going after the Parthians in the Far East because of they had been making trouble on the borders of the Roman Empire. And so he calls her to Tarsus, which is over near Syria on the coast, and she comes and they make a deal. Now there's a very famous scene in which she comes on her pleasure barge and he invites her to dine with him, and she says, "No, you come and dine with me." Now, in the movie Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton is humiliated and doesn't know what to do because it really should be the one who's the more powerful should invite the one who's less powerful. In reality, Antony probably couldn't care less. He enjoyed a good time and he was going to get it. And so he went onto the barge and she displayed her lavish barge and everything, the luxuries that she had, and duly impressed him with the Egyptian luxuries. And of course, so they fall for each other. Antony's very much in love with her. And as their relationship develops, they become, to the people, they are the gods, Dionysus, if you're Roman, or Osiris, Antony, if Cleopatra becomes Aphrodite to the Romans, or Isis to the Egyptians. And even though they cannot be married, they are, in a sense, to many Egyptians, considered married in a spiritual sort of way. And they loved it. The Egyptians really liked Antony. And so Antony and Cleopatra spend time together. They're very probably in love. And again, the pleasure boat of Cleopatra. But Cleopatra doesn't come just for the sake of helping him out. She has her own demands. And so there's a series of negotiations that Cleopatra is going to demand something for the help that she's giving to Antony. And so Antony gives some port cities out of Syria and Judea to her. And he has her sister Arsinoe IV, executed as well, because Cleopatra suspects, and probably rightly so, that at some time her younger sister is going to plot against her. One thing that Antony would not give is Judea. Judea, as I said before, had been very grateful to Julius Caesar for defeating Pompey and had given a lot of help to Caesar and promised to give more help to Antony. And so he felt that he was somewhat indebted to them and wanted to keep their favor as well. So even though Cleopatra did want to take and rule Judea as well, Antony would not give it to her.
Was it he or she that executed her sister?
So she asked him to have someone take her, arrest her, and execute her. So, during this time, when Antony's away, his wife Fulvia decides that she doesn't like Octavius very much and leads a rebellion against him with her brother, and it fails. She escapes to Antony and pleads with him that she meant well. She wanted to defeat Octavius so that Antony could be in charge, but she failed. She also died right after this of some illness. Historians don't generally suspect any foul play. She apparently just had some illness and died. So Antony at this time, although he's preparing for this great Parthian campaign, had to go back to Rome and patch things up with Octavius. And so he did. It was not easy because it was his wife who was leading this rebellion, and Octavius suspected, not without reason, that Antony was behind it. In any case, they patched things up, and at this time, while Antony's away, Cleopatra has twins from Antony, and they named them Alexander and Cleopatra. And to add on to that, it was Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the sun and the moon. And here's Fulvia, one of the first women, by the way, to ever have her face on a Roman coin. Cleopatra was after that.
Wasn't she the daughter of some high-up Roman?
Yes, yeah, and I don't remember either who that would be. But yeah, she was well connected in her family.
Wait, Alexander what? Was the children
Alexander Helios, as in the
Helios.
sun.
Okay,
And Cleopatra Selene,
Selene.
which is the moon. So now that Antony is unmarried, and all of Rome dreading another civil war, they want to patch things up and to solidify this new relationship between Antony and Octavius. Antony marries Octavian's sister, Octavia. And Octavian decides he needs a new wife as well, so he divorces the wife that he has and marries Scribonia. Very quickly, both of these wives are pregnant. And because of that, at this time in Rome, there was a great deal of celebration, or at least a good feeling that things were coming together now, that we're done with all of the civil wars, that now we have peace, that these two men are now related. And so with these women pregnant, Virgil, the great poet, decides that a new age has begun, and that from one or both of these women will come a son who will set the world right. And so this is part of Virgil's fourth eclogue. Now returns the maid, returns the reign of Saturn. Now from high heaven a new generation comes down. Yet do thou at that boy's birth, in whom the iron race shall begin to cease, and the golden to arise over all the world. And of course, this sounds very much like Christianity. And the early Christians took this to mean Virgil's really predicting the birth of Christ. So here is Octavia. She's called Octavia the Younger. Very beautiful woman, very virtuous. All of Rome sees her as a great catch for Antony, that he will now truly appreciate Roman values because he has a solid, good, virtuous Roman wife. But then he goes back to Cleopatra. Anyway, so during this time also, Cleopatra, who had been with Antony, is traveling back, she's in Egypt. Herod, who has been put in charge in Judea, talking about Herod the Great, of Bible fame. The Parthians are invading. They took over Syria and Judea. Herod escaped, took asylum in Egypt, and eventually went to Rome to plead his case. Cleopatra and Herod generally, we believe, despised each other because each of them knew that the other wanted Judea. But they were polite to each other. They knew they had to be because Rome stood above all. Here's Herod the Great. So, despite the fact that he has a good, virtuous, beautiful Roman bride, he goes back to Cleopatra. Most likely, again, he sees in Cleopatra a power that is just unknown in most people. So he kicked the Parthians out of Syria and Judea, but he still needs support for a major Parthian campaign to go to the Parthians themselves and destroy them. And he needs more supplies, so he, again, asks Cleopatra, I need money, I need ships, I need men. And she says, well, what are you going to give me? So he gives up more cities, and he gives up date palm groves that make a lot of money, balsam shrubs that produce the balm of Gilead, that is famous from the Bible also, known as a healing type incense from the balsam shrubs. But Antony officially installs Herod at this time as the king of Judea. The Parthian campaign, one of the greatest Roman armies of all time, is collected and utterly is destroyed in this campaign. Antony, on his campaign, splits up his forces between the baggage and the catapults and all of that, the heavy stuff, and the lighter infantry, so that he could reach the main city that he was after more quickly. During this time, one of his allies from a foreign country decides they're going to switch sides and go against him. And his baggage train, along with all the siege engines, are completely destroyed. Antony arrives at this city that he's going to besiege and finds out that he doesn't have any of the catapults and siege weapons with which to take the city. And so he's come there for nothing and must make the long trip back in hostile territory with all of the surrounding countries knowing that he's been defeated. A very bad situation, very much like Napoleon coming back from Moscow. He was picked apart the entire way, and the weather didn't help. Going over mountains in winter, it was an utterly horrendous scene for Antony to go through. At certain points in this journey back, he was seriously contemplating killing himself because of the great disaster that this was. Anyway, he makes it back with a much smaller army, and he wants Cleopatra to help supply him again. She meets him in Syria. She has almost nothing to give him, just a few supplies and no money. Antony, who had money himself, decided to distribute that amongst his troops and say, this is from Cleopatra. Also at this time, Octavian sends his sister with supplies and troops to Antony. Antony says, thank you for the supplies, thank you for the troops. Octavia, you can go home. We don't want you here. And so Octavia goes back to Rome, where she cares for their two daughters. She also cares for Antony's other children from Fulvia and her original 3 children that she had from a previous marriage. And the Romans see this and are just outraged that Antony could spurn such a virtuous woman. So Antony very quickly is losing popularity in Rome. And then we have the donations. This is called donations because, well, Antony and Cleopatra are giving away the territories of the East to their children, creating in their children, there'll be kings and queens as children. Not that they're going to go to these territories, and some of the territories weren't even conquered yet. But this is on your handout as well. I have that, there's a map that shows how it is divided up. Another thing here is that there was a minor victory over the Parthians in Asia Minor, and so in order to bolster his popularity, at least in Egypt, they have a great celebration of this great triumph. And again, the Romans are incensed. You do not have a triumph anywhere except in Rome. But he held his triumph in Egypt, in Alexandria. And the donations. So here, the eastern half of the empire is divided up. Alexander Helios was to have this territory right here, despite the fact that it's not even conquered at this point. And Ptolemy, by the way, this is another child that they had. So they had 3 altogether. Ptolemy Philadelphus was to have this territory that was not entirely conquered either. And then we have Cleopatra and Ptolemy the 15th. And then Cleopatra Selene with this territory.
What happened to Caesarion?
So Caesarion is still there, and I'm kind of questioning why they don't have that one too. I don't know. There should be something there for Caesarion as well, except unless it was just that he was going to take Antony's place overall upon his death. So here are Cleopatra's children. Caesarion, born in 47 BC, Alexander Helios, and Cleopatra Selene in 40, and then Ptolemy Philadelphus in 36 BC. And we do have images of 3 of them, Caesarion and then the twins. This is all that we have that's any representation of them. So at this point we have the final break with Octavian. Octavian, along with most of Rome, is outraged at what Antony is doing. And so he speaks out in the Senate against Antony and this whore of Egypt, Cleopatra. Antony's still trying to hold on to some of his popularity by bribing the Senate. He had money. As I say, Egypt is a very rich country. And so he would get money from Cleopatra, and he would bribe with lavish gifts members of the Senate in order to have them, stay on his side. He tried to get this whole donations ceremony legalized in the Senate. It didn't work, but he did try. And then finally, Octavian knew that the time had come. He was going to declare war, but he could not, or he was not going to declare war on Antony. He was going to declare war on Cleopatra and Egypt and leave Antony to do as he liked. He knew that Antony came with it, but he didn't want to call this a civil war. Also, he wanted a triumph afterwards. You cannot have a triumph in a civil war fighting against Romans. You could only have a triumph if you conquered foreign territory. So Octavian was going to declare war and fight Cleopatra. And so we have the famous Battle of Actium in 31 BC. It is often depicted as a great battle in which the ships, or the decision was, do we fight against Octavian on land, or do we fight him at sea? And Cleopatra is depicted as the one saying, no, Antony, let's fight him at sea. And the generals saying, no, we should fight him on land. We're better on land. But Antony being so in love with Cleopatra that he follows her advice, and they fight at sea and are defeated. It wasn't like that. The way it turned out was that once they went to Greece to set up this battle, Antony was there first. He took several port cities to control the sea routes. Unfortunately for him, Agrippa, who was Octavian's first general, was a much better general than anything that Antony had. And he captured these port cities, the major port cities, and then controlled the sea routes himself, and basically had Antony and Cleopatra trapped. And so there was a decision. Were we going to escape by land or escape by sea? It was no longer a decision of how are we going to fight and win. They did not expect to win at this point. It was, what are we going to do now to escape? They actually tried by land and didn't quite make it. Ultimately, historians will tell you that he had to go by sea because the Egyptians had supplied many of the ships. He could not abandon them. If he did, he would have lost all of his Egyptian support and had nothing but Romans, which was not enough at that point to save him. So the plan was to break out. It was not to go out and defeat Octavian. The whole plan was to escape. So here's Actium in Greece, right here. So as I say, the decision was to escape by sea. There were 400 ships of Octavian and 230, thereabouts, for Antony. They escaped. Most importantly, they escaped themselves with the treasure ships who had all the money. There were only about 60 ships once they finally escaped that were left to them. Another depiction, Battle of Actium. And another battle map. Here's where they had their camps and they broke out and returned to Alexandria. When they returned to Alexandria, they celebrated a great triumph over Octavian. They knew, Cleopatra knew especially, you better celebrate when you get home, because otherwise all of the cutthroats waiting to overthrow you in Alexandria will take advantage and you will be overthrown. So they arrive and celebrate their great victory. It fooled them for a time, but you could only play that up for so long. Also, immediately when they got there, Cleopatra decided that she was going to kill all of her opponents. All of the major names that she knew opposed her, she had executed. And this was not a small number, because there was probably a revolt coming. And so after celebrating their victory, they had another celebration. Caesarion was turning 16, and so they threw a great party for him as well. After that, Cleopatra decided she needed to make plans to either escape herself with Antony or without, and to send Caesarion away as well for their own protection. She transported a number of ships over to the Red Sea to make her escape. They were burned as soon as they got there from the Nabatean king, who didn't like Cleopatra at all, Malchus. And once Cleopatra found out that her ships, her way of escaping, had been destroyed, she sent someone to murder him. Herod, seeing which way the wind is blowing, decides he's going to side with Octavian now. And Herod was a man who is well known to be a very devoted and loyal servant of Rome. And he could be loyal to a fault. He was loyal for a time to Antony, but he knew that Antony had been defeated. So now he sides with Octavian. Antony is now negotiating. He wants to live. He's asking if he can retire to some province somewhere, either with or without Cleopatra, and he gets no answer. He sends another message. If I kill myself, will you let Cleopatra live? He gets no answer. And all the while Octavian is closing in. One of the things that Octavian needs is the treasure. He always has difficulty paying his troops. And if you do not pay your troops and have them well supplied, the troops turn on you. He knew he had to get that treasure ship, or the treasure that Cleopatra had. So Cleopatra is now goes to hide in that great monument with her treasure. Antony sees the troops coming. He sends out his troops, and they defeat a small advanced guard. But knowing that that was not going to amount to much, Antony's fleet goes out to attack the Octavians and promptly surrenders. At this point, they have no choice but to commit suicide, or at least so they see it. Antony, first out on the battlefield or outside, hears the rumors that Cleopatra has already committed suicide, so he stabs himself. There's a scene in the play, Antony and Cleopatra, where he tells his armor bearer, Eros, to stab him. Eros stabs himself instead, because he could not bear to stab Antony. And this is from Plutarch as well. This wasn't just Shakespeare's making this up. And so Antony, seeing that his servant has killed himself, says, in effect, you're a better man than me, and I better do it myself. And so he stabs himself rather clumsily in the gut and does not die right away. One of the most painful wounds, I understand, is a gut shot, or a gut wound. And so he's suffering terribly, but he's not dying right away. Anyway, Cleopatra hears that Antony is dying, and so she sends her servants to grab him, take him up to the temple where she's at, and he dies in her arms, purportedly. At that time, Octavian arrives a little bit later and kind of storms the temple and captures her before she could commit suicide. Now, there's a lot of debate as to what happens next. The legend is that she's in this temple being kept by Octavian, and Octavian is wanting to take her back to Rome so she could march in his triumph. Other historians will say that's probably not the case. He had seen others, like her younger sister, march in his triumphs and got a lot of sympathy from the people. And he didn't want her to gain much sympathy. Right now, everybody hated her, and he wanted it to stay that way. So, the other debate is, how exactly did she do it? The legend is that she had a snake, an asp, in a basket of figs brought to her, and she took it and had it bite her, and she died that way. Most likely that was not the case, because it was not just her, but it was also her ladies-in-waiting, a couple of servants there with her, who also died using the same means. The Egyptians in general, and Cleopatra in particular, were well known to be very knowledgeable in poisons. Poison was an industry in Egypt. That is one of the best ways to knock off your rivals. So the Egyptians in power knew the right poisons, and the poisons that will kill you without pain. And that's what she wanted as well. So she had somebody sneak in something that she took, and her ladies took as well, to kill her and them. One of the arguments against the asp is that if an asp bites one person, it has just given up a lot of venom. It's not going to kill 3 people. It doesn't have enough venom. So anyway, she commits suicide. Octavian probably wanted it that way, so you wouldn't have to worry about her gaining any more sympathy in Rome. And so what happens to her children? Caesarion was killed. Octavian knew that Caesarion had to go. He would be a force to be reckoned with as he grew up. He would gather, as the son of Julius Caesar the Great, who is now a god, he inevitably would attract a following. But the rest of Cleopatra's children, they were brought to Rome, they marched in the triumph, and they were allowed to live. We don't know what happened to the boys. Oh, and by the way, they were given to Octavia also to raise. Just great-hearted woman. Also, the statues of Cleopatra. Octavian wanted to do away with her memory, or at least soil it enough so that she was no longer a sympathetic character. However, first, he did destroy all of Antony's statues, but there was a very wealthy man in Egypt who asked that he not destroy Cleopatra's, because she was now, in a sense, a saint in Egypt. And so, for the small sum of 2,000 talents, Octavian allowed her statues to remain. And there grew up, and even the one in Rome was allowed to stay in Venus's temple. And there was a cult of Cleopatra. Despite the fact that Octavian did everything in his power to erase any good writings about her and promote the idea that she was a lascivious whore who slept with many men and killed people just for the fun of it. There was a cult of Cleopatra that lasted up until the Christian era in Rome. And so since that time, as we know, Cleopatra, there's been a lot of propaganda. On the one side, there's a propaganda that says that Cleopatra was the Egyptian whore, the evil temptress who seduced noble Romans. But there was also the other side that depicted her as the most complete woman to have ever lived, and a model of devotion and self-sacrifice because of her devotion to both Caesar and Antony. So in any case, I think today we have a much better view of who Cleopatra really was. It is a shame, though, that there's so much more that we would like to have known that was destroyed because of Octavian. Any questions? All right, thank you very much. So as you see, next week is Eleanor of Aquitaine.